in 2023. Our main work areas include prevention of child sexual abuse, menstrual sexual reproductive health and rights for migrant workers, teaching comprehensive gender and sexuality education, and awareness programs like workshops, street plays, campaigns, research, and publications. We also provide crisis support to survivors of gender-based violence and sexual abuse. So according to the poll taken during the registration, almost 95% of you agree that sexual abuse is a public health crisis. And that gives us a lot of comfort and maybe a little bit of confidence to start today's session. In the last 3 years, we have reached more than 7,000 people directly. Unschooled children, students, informal laborers, parents, teachers, doctors, mental health experts, lawyers, social workers, and caregivers. And during all of our community interactions, we repeatedly encountered some recurring patterns. And that raised an important question. What if sexual abuse is not only a social issue, but also a public health crisis? This made us examine the issue more systematically and ultimately led us to our central thesis guiding this research: sexual abuse is a public health crisis in India. This discussion also builds on the findings from an anonymous survey that we conducted for 16 days of activism against gender-based violence campaign. And the initial findings of the surveys produced some substantial yet shocking results, which incidentally coincides with NCRB and some other independent data as well. For example, 90% of the abusers are family and trusted people. 50% of survivors were refused help when they asked, and 82% suffer from mental health issues and employment insecurities. So we understand that when our quality of life is restricted by trauma, it harms our health. When we are wounded, it affects how we move through the world, how safe we feel, and what opportunities we can access. So if sexual abuse is as common as the data suggests, then that means it's not an isolated behavior. Hence, it becomes a public health crisis with two distinct manifestations. A, the health impact on victim survivors, and B, the mental health crisis in abusers. And we here at Garima Trust plan to address the disease, that is the abusive nature, its symptoms, that is the abuse, and the casualty, that's the victim survivor. So the agenda for today would include discussing our research so far and followed by your inputs and suggestions for the road ahead for us. So let's start. Now let's start with public health. I'm pretty sure a huge number of people here are working around public health in some way or the other. But let's begin with some rudimentary introduction to the concept of public health and what makes something a public health issue. And let's start from there. So with our recent experience of surviving COVID-19, we understand how a public health issue can spread from an individual to the family, to the neighboring areas, then to communities, and finally society at large. The Center of Disease and Control Prevention, USA, defines public health as a science and art of preventing diseases, prolonging life, and promoting health through organized societal efforts. And it also states that sexual violence, as all sexual activity for which consent has not been obtained or cannot be given freely, is a significant public health crisis. And in India, Doctors Rajan Solanki, Priyanka Yadav, and Yogesh Bahurupi from the Department of Community Medicine's AIIMS Nagpur also calls sexual violence a major public health issue with substantial personal and societal repercussions. While now there is some ample evidence around us and studies to corroborate this thesis, what's challenging here is to make this narrative common among people and not leave it in an academic or an expert level ruminations. So what we here hope to do is, through our research and then forth, create mass awareness and action plan to prevent child sexual abuse and sexual abuse in Indian societies. Now, June will walk us through the findings of our research so far.
Thank you, Nikita. So we're going to start today with discussing the health impact on survivors, or victims and survivors of sexual abuse. Now, sexual abuse and violence leaves lifelong, not just an immediate or temporary impact on the person's health, but a lifelong impact on their physical, mental, social, and even economic health. So, to expand on that, some common physical health risks, including immediate harm from the assault, contracting STD or STIs, unwanted pregnancies, or long-term health impacts like chronic pain, other autoimmune diseases arising from negative impacts on mental health. Through a deep sense of shock, trauma, they can be prone to depression, anxiety, issues around their self-image, and even an impact on their sexuality in a negative way. We also know that survivors can be prone to addiction, to self-harm, to disordered eating or sleeping patterns. And when it comes to their psychosocial health, which is their relationships with intimate relationships, family, friends, workplace, colleagues, peers, and their overall general growth and development in life takes a back seat as a survivor. And the most importantly here, it also leaves an impact on their economic health, in terms of their ability of employment, their struggles around performance, their anxieties around showing up, turning up to different places. All of this contributes to the person also suffering significant economic impacts and losses. So here is it's a small snapshot of a study done in the US by CDCP, where they assign a lifetime cost of sexual abuse or violence on the victim survivor. So we see it is estimated to be somewhere around $123,000 per victim. Now, this includes costs around their healthcare, treatment, legal and judiciary proceedings, any loss to their property, or any damage that they have to make up for. But what's interesting here is when we look at it in a pie format, it shows that the most substantial amount of cost is attributed to the lost productivity of the victim survivor. And as public health workers, it is but natural for us to deduce that lost productivity is a direct sign of a person's deteriorating physical and mental health. So while this is in US dollars, I am sure if we apply similar formula, we will also be able to find out the lifetime cost of survivors in Indian rupees. And finding out the economic cost in no way diminishes the struggle of the survivors or the victims, but it is to understand that the repercussions are far beyond interpersonal or far beyond mental health troubles for the survivor. It is something that impacts them through their life in multiple ways. Now, here are some data points that we will share with you. We will also be sharing this presentation with all of you, and each slide has the, you can check on the data that is being shared with you using all the links that are provided below. So we know in India, 1 in 3 women suffer sexual abuse at home. 1 in 2 women suffer sexual abuse at their workplace. 2 in 3 women suffer sexual abuse at their workplace. 1 in 2 women face it at public places like transportation and other shared spaces. 1 in 3 women suffer online abuse. 1 in 2 women suffer abuse in their education institution. Also, 1 in 2 trans women and 1 in 2 queer women also suffer from sexual abuse. And 1 in 2 women were sexually abused under the age of 18, which is child sexual abuse. The next data we will look at is on child sexual abuse. Here I would like to highlight a monumental study that was conducted in 2007 by the Ministry of Women and Child Development on child sexual abuse across India. A study of the same nature has not yet been replicated. This surveyed 137,000 children across 17 different states of India from different socioeconomic, religious, and caste backgrounds. And the study is obviously available for all of us to go back to. While it's from 2007, the numbers are still relevant. So what we found in that study is that every second Indian child with a little bit of a higher percentage towards boys under the age of 13 at 52%, girls under the state of, and girls at 48% are victims of child sexual abuse. Further research has also shown us that 1 out of every 2 children is victim of online sexual abuse. 1 in 2 child sexual abuse material online is also first posted by parents or family members. Just to elaborate a little on the last point, what do we mean by child sexual abuse material, which earlier would be known as child pornography? What happens is that people post very harmless, innocent material of their children, like a day outing or a birthday photo. What we mistake for security online is not really a good standard of privacy and security for our online usage. So a lot of these photos are screenshot or downloaded by abusers who then digitally morph these pictures into child sexual abuse material. It is easy for these material photos of children to end up with child sexual abuses. Now we come to the most difficult part of the data collection, which is abuse on men. As I guess all of us here might agree that it is particularly harder for men to admit that they have been sexually abused, and especially in India. So the data is a little scattered but strong enough to give us a clear picture. We see that around 18% married men have admitted to being forced to engage in marital sex, which we in other terms would call marital rape. 18 to 38% of urban males have reported workplace harassment. A lot of queer, gay, and bisexual men have reported intimate partner violence. And most importantly, 51% of all surveyed men admit that they have experienced child sexual abuse. So, the reason for us to put up these numbers is to first and foremost understand how common sexual abuse is in Indian society. We are talking about 1 in every 2 children, 1 in every 2 women and queer people, and a lot of men who are systemically exposed to sexual abuse, whether it's in their safe places or it is in public shared spaces. So we're going to now move on to understand sexual abuse as a behavior a little more deeply. We have bifurcated sexual abuse cases into 3 main categories. One, where it's a one-time attack on 1 or many victims. The second is an organized attack on 1 or many victims. An example of organized attack would be weaponizing sexual abuse and rape as a war tool by militaries and law enforcement and police across the world, especially on minorities. And the third type would be continued attack on groomed victims or multiple groomed victims. Now, what do we mean by the third point here? Continued attacks are cases of abuse that are ongoing. These are more in intimate relationships and safe places as opposed to an aggravated assault, as in the case of a one-time attack or an organized attack. Continued attack is a silent killer. It is a slow burning process where the abused, the victim survivor, often loses their confidence to seek any support or help because of the nature of the abuse. So Not to say that the first two are in any way lesser in numbers, but the third, which is the continued abuse, repeated abuse patterns, having multiple victims from one person, these are the more hidden and difficult to express cases of abuse. Now we understand that a one-time attack or an organized attack might happen from external forces pushing you towards it, while not completely. But what is important here to understand is when an abuser has multiple victims, or when an abuser is using a safe space to create an abusive environment, what are the tools that they are using? So, how we understand this is abusers gamify the process of abuse. Whether it is gender-based violence or it is sexual abuse, there is a process of gamification. What does that mean? It means turning the practice into something that gives you instant gratification, just like an online video game. So, it all begins with targeting, and of course, anybody can be a target, unlike our common belief that vulnerable populations are more exposed to sexual abuse. That's not true. Everybody can be equally vulnerable to be a target. It's a sheer matter of luck. The next stage is the grooming process, where the abuser would acquire the faith and the trust of the victim, of people around them. They will place themselves as a safe person, as a trusted person within the abused victim's life, so that they have further control and power over their everyday comings and goings. And the third stage is where the abuse begins in earnest. Now, once the abuse is continued for a considerable amount of time, victim survivors may enter what is known as a Stockholm state, which is to say the person increasingly loses their ability to complain. They start assuming that they have a role to play in this abuse, that they are at fault in some way or the other, and asking for help will only raise more questions and fingers at them. This is the Stockholm syndrome, which makes the person continue in that situation without seeking any support. And in the worst case scenario, they might even convince themselves that the abuse I'm going through is not real. And this is where the cycle comes full, and the person has now established their control over the abused victim's body, mind, and life. And this is where they start looking out for newer targets while continuing the abuse on the existing target. Our research has shown us that most abusers have at least 5 to 7 victims in their lifetime, minimum 5 to 7 victims in their lifetime, which goes us to show that this is not a one-time behavior. Mostly, it is a pattern that is repeated again and again by the abusive person. Now, what we don't know is who are all these abusers. So, if 1 in 2 children, 1 in 2 women, and so many men are victims, who are the abusers? While we don't have any definitive answer to it, there are some insights that can help us identify them, or rather understand the entry point of risk. So here we see that 1 in 3 cases happen at home. 90% abusers are people that the victim survivor already trusted as a safe person. So abuses are happening at safe places with safe people. And while 90% abusers are identified men, there are also 10% abusers who are women. So being an abuser is also not a given for a certain gender. Anybody can be an abuser. We know that abusers tend to display other signs of abusive behavior like gender-based violence, domestic violence, battery, or emotional manipulation and abuse. Most importantly, we know that only 3% of convicted child sexual abusers can be diagnosed as pedophiles. A pedophile is a person who exclusively is sexually attracted to prepubescent children. But 97% of child sexual abusers are not pedophiles. They are heterosexual human beings in fulfilling relationships with adult partners, and they are also child sexual abusers. So this is where we say it is never about sex, it is always about power and control. While the Jeffrey Epstein files are doing the rounds, we are all talking a lot about the kind of reality that we live in, and how much do we know, how much do we not know, how much do we try to avoid from knowing. But to me, at this moment, what's most important is to not get carried away into thinking that abusers are all Jeffrey Epstein, that they are super rich, super powerful, very connected people with a lot of social capital, monsters who are beyond our reach and control. That's not true. While the case is extremely hideous, this is not the only type of abuse that happens. Like we have been discussing, abuse happens in safe places, through safe people, and we can never be careful enough. And it's a fallacy from our end if we think abusers are all larger than life characters. So a good example of that is every time we see a news of a child being sexually abused, the natural reaction we have is, what type of a person does that? What monster must he be? But we cannot say that that person is a monster. That person might be a very regular person living right next door. So our point here is to just underline the fact that abusers come in all shapes and sizes and gender, and there is no one fixed identity of an abuser. And not all abusers are monsters. Now, what psychology can confirm so far, while we don't know exactly why somebody would sexually abuse another person, but there are some things which are quite solid for us to start working from. At the bottom of it all lies the need for power and control. Now, there can be other aspects that is pushing the person towards this need for power and control, like insecurities, distrust, misogyny, being a bully, which is being a survivor and now acting out the pain through perpetrating abuse on another victim. Sometimes you are also trained to perpetrate sexual violence, like we already discussed in the case of organized usage of sexual violence as a tool in war and in civil unrest. But at no point should we forget that all of these reasons, including the ones that society claims are the real reasons for sexual abuse, which is a patriarchal mindset or excessive child sexual abuse, survivors growing up to be abusers, excessive pornographic material online, media and pop representation, feminism, where more women and gender sexual minorities are in public mainstream spaces, which further increases the insecurity in certain groups of people. Now, these are all underlying reasons. Ultimately, the reason it's important for us to differentiate the reason to sexually abuse from a sexual need or desire. It's never about a sexual desire. It is about gaining power and control over the body, mind of the victim, of the person who you are targeting. And that is a stand that Garima Trust firmly believes in, which is that sexual abuse is never a result of unmet sexual needs or desires. It is only and only a display of power and control over those who are weaker than us. An interesting tool used in psychology to understand abusers is called the Darbo effect. Now, what Darbo basically stands for is deny, attack, reverse victim order, which means you first deny. So, for example, if a person raises a complaint, the step one is to deny. No, this didn't happen, you're lying. Step two is to attack the person. How can you make a complaint like that about a person, such a well-established person? Next comes reversal of the case itself, the reversal of the situation itself, where the person who complained is the victim is now shown as the offender, and the offender is shown as the victim. So an extremely common case of that is how Indian society talks about sexual abuse in public places. So we start with, she must be lying for attention. Then we move on to, but what were you doing there so late at night? Why were you alone? Why were you in those clothes? Why were you not at home? And then we reverse the victim and the offender. So the abuser, who is the offender, is no longer the offender. They become the victim because the victim has been asking for it, quote unquote, by exposing themselves to these dangerous situations. So, to sum it up, what Darvo is basically a tool for manipulation. It's a tool used by abusers to blame the victim, to never take accountability for the complaint or the grievance that is being put forth by the victim. It's a very easy way to make people doubt themselves, and this technique often triggers self-doubt in the victim themselves. And with that, we want to talk about the cause and effect relationship. So, one part of the public health issue as we see it is the poor mental health condition of especially young boys and men in our society, not restricting to only men, but especially young boys and men in our society. This poor mental health, whether it's arising from their insecurities or their fading relevance in society, this poor mental health creates bad behavioral and psychosocial patterns, which leads to the person committing the act of abusing sexually. Now, the impact or the effect of that cause is 360-degree on the survivor. Not only are they suffering physically, they are suffering mentally, they are suffering in their relationships, they're suffering economically, they're suffering socially, and like we discussed, oftentimes it can also lead to loss of life, a possible loss of life. So, while the public health issue might have two strong manifestations, it is never to compare the severity of the health impact on the survivor compared to the mental health degradation or poor quality of mental health of the abuser. But at the same time, we should not overlook the mental health crisis in men that is driving the rape culture further in India. The more your identity belongs to a minority, whether you are a minority from caste or from religion or from any other, or from your sexuality, any other minority marker that is put on the victim makes it so much harder for the person to A, seek justice, and to B, get any sort of justice. So if we talk about, for example, if we talk about the Kunan Pushpora rapes that happened, or if we talk about Bilkis Banu, or if we talk about the Unnao case that is currently going on, these are all women who are at the margins of society. What happened in Hathras. These are all cases where the victims are from the very margins of different kinds of margins of society, and it becomes doubly harder because now she is no longer just a victim of sexual abuse. She is also a Dalit sexual abuse victim, or a Muslim sexual abuse victim, or a lesbian sexual abuse victim. So, to take a look at the survey findings here. So, like I said, there are 20 questions, but we are going to share a few data points with you. So, the first one is 50% of our responders have suffered child sexual abuse in their own home. As a child and also as an adult. But 50% respondents have suffered sexual abuse in their own home. 58% respondents have suffered sexual abuse online. This question asks them to identify the different shared spaces where people have faced sexual abuse. And as you can see, the number of people who never faced it in a shared space is super low. It's 16%. But an overwhelming number of people have faced abuse in their relatives' homes, during family events, and in public transport. So just to comment here that a relative's home or a family event seems like a place where the abuser can use their identity as a safe adult in a safe place or a safe person in a safe place. But interestingly, in public transport or in public spaces, they are weaponizing the anonymity. So both the familiarity and the anonymity is weaponized by abusers. The next point is how many of our respondents are forced to live with their sexual abusers, coexist with them. So as we can see, 60% of our respondents are forced to coexist with their abusers, whether it's at home, at work, in school, in any institution, which is a really scary number because um, not only is the person going through the repercussions and the health impact of the abuse, but it is a daily aggravation. They are interacting with their abuser on a daily basis, especially in intimate relationships or with family members. You see your abuser every day, which leaves you almost no room to heal, almost no room to seek any form of justice. When we asked, participants said that they have asked for help, they have raised complaints. 51% have complained, whether it's at home or it's at their workplace or in their institution. But 56% of the people who did complain got no help, which goes to show that again, placing the entire responsibility on the victim survivor might not be the best way to move ahead, because oftentimes, even when they do seek support, they are not provided with that support. When it comes to health, 82% of our participants have complaints around sleep and eating disorder, fatigue, depression, and lack of motivation. And 45% of our respondents have chronic body pain in one or multiple parts and a continuing complaint of physical pain. Now, we will be sharing the larger findings of the survey and a comprehensive report of it. These were just snapshots of some of the questions and data points that stood out to us a lot. As I said, we have to be extremely sensitive when designing these surveys, because there are participants who can really suffer from revisiting all of those past experiences. So it's quite a difficult task to conduct these surveys. People have to be extremely mindful and sensitive to the survey takers as well.
I guess not just survey, just research on this particular topic. It's quite complicated because it is kind of like a pandemic. So the question is, you will always wonder about things. Where do I start? How do I start with eradicating it? Do I start with doing all at once? Or do I start with simply trying to label it as a public health issue and then going from there on? It is quite complicated, and the important part is to put the survivor at the forefront and understand that survivor's comfort and survivor's health needs to be prioritized, right? When we say things like child-centric approach, survivor-centric approach, that means your data points shouldn't come at a cost of the survivor. And no data will be useful in any way if it is at the cost of the survivors.
And conducting research on the topic in itself begins with that very limitation, that not a lot of us would be able to have very open conversations or even thoughts around these topics. So with that, we do come to the end of today's presentation. Yes, I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of you for joining us today.